The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows on the busy streets of the city. A police officer, Officer Daniels, was on patrol. He had been on the force for years, and his rough manner and quick temper had earned him a reputation among his colleagues. He had seen it all, or so he thought, and he wasn't afraid to take charge, often with little regard for how others might feel. As he drove through the city streets, his eyes scanned the people walking by, always on the lookout for something to challenge his authority. That's when he saw her, a woman, walking alone along the sidewalk. Her steps were calm, but something about her stood out. She was pregnant, her belly round and visible beneath her loose clothes, and there was a determined look on her face. Officer Daniels immediately felt his instincts kick in. Something didn't seem right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Without giving it much thought, he decided to stop her. He pulled up his squad car beside her, the tires screeching slightly as he slammed the brakes. The sudden stop made her glance over at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. He got out of the car with his hand resting on his holster, his posture aggressive and demanding. He didn't need a reason. To him, he was in charge. "Hey, you," Officer Daniels barked, his voice sharp. "What are you doing out here alone? It's not safe." The woman, slightly startled, raised her hand as if to shield herself from the sudden tension in the air. "I'm just walking home," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Officer Daniels wasn't satisfied with that answer. His mind began to race with assumptions. He had seen countless people like her, people he believed didn't belong, people who were always up to something. His thoughts blurred, and his frustration grew. He stepped closer to her, towering over her pregnant form, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk around here without being questioned? Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled, his voice growing more hostile. The woman stood her ground, but the tension in the air thickened. She could feel the heat of his anger, and though she wasn't afraid, her mind raced. She had experienced worse before, but there was something different about this encounter. She remained silent, trying to remain calm, but Officer Daniels wasn't about to let up. Without warning, he reached out, grabbing her arm roughly to stop her from moving. The sudden movement caused her to lose her balance for a moment, and she stumbled. Officer Daniels sneered, believing this was a sign of weakness. He wasn't used to being ignored or challenged, especially not by someone he saw as powerless. The woman, still calm despite the sudden aggression, steadied herself. She could feel the adrenaline rising, but she did her best to keep it under control. This wasn't the time to lose her composure. Yet, Officer Daniels, fueled by his own assumptions, grew bolder. His patience was running thin, and his voice became louder, demanding answers that the woman wasn't ready to give. He was convinced that something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let her go without a fight. He stepped forward, his hand still gripping her arm. His next move would shock them both. Officer Daniels had no idea who the woman was, or just how much he had just misjudged her. As the minutes passed after their encounter, he felt sure that she was just another person in the city, with no connection to the things that truly mattered. What he didn't know, however, was that the woman he had confronted on the street was not some random person. She was one of the most powerful figures in the country's legal system. The woman's name was Judge Amina Walker, and she had earned her reputation through years of hard work and an unwavering sense of justice. Born and raised in the city, she had seen firsthand how the legal system could fail those without a voice. That's why she had devoted her life to making sure everyone, no matter their background, received a fair trial. Her career had taken her to the highest courts in the land, and there were few who didn't fear her sharp mind and her ability to cut through lies and deception with a single look. Her story wasn't one of privilege. Amina came from humble beginnings. Her parents had struggled to make ends meet, and she had spent much of her childhood in tough neighborhoods, often watching her friends and family members face unfair treatment by the law. As a young girl, she had witnessed her older brother get arrested for something he didn't do, and that event had changed her life. She vowed that one day she would change the system that had treated her family so cruelly. It was this determination that had driven her to law school, and later to become a judge. Her rise had not been easy. Many doubted her ability simply because of her gender and the color of her skin. But Amina was resilient. She had become a symbol of hope for the oppressed, and her decisions had earned her respect. And yes, fear from many people in power. Amina had always kept a low profile when out in public, never drawing attention to herself, preferring to focus on her work rather than seek personal recognition. But despite her desire for privacy, there was always a sense that her presence commanded respect wherever she went. That day, as she walked home from a long day at the courthouse, she was simply trying to get some fresh air, her mind on the cases she had ruled on that afternoon. She was looking forward to going home and relaxing. Being pregnant had made her even more determined to keep a low profile. The world could be unpredictable, and she had learned long ago that sometimes it was best not to draw attention to yourself, even when you held power in the courtroom. Yet, as she walked down the street, she had never imagined that she would run into someone like Officer Daniels, who was quick to judge and act without understanding the full picture. She had hoped that, for once, she could just blend in. But she would soon find that the encounter was about to change everything for both her and the officer. After the confrontation on the street, Judge Amina Walker took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. She wasn't used to being in situations like this, where her authority had been challenged in such an unexpected and rude way. Though shaken, she knew that reacting with anger would only make things worse. She focused on her breathing, trying to gather her strength. Her first concern was for her unborn child, and she needed to make sure that both of them were okay after the assault. She continued walking, her steps steady, though inside her mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. What kind of person would treat a pregnant woman that way? The officer's aggression and harsh words were not just uncalled for, they were terrifying. But Amina had learned to stay calm in difficult situations. She had learned that the best way to deal with those who sought to put others down was to rise above them, quietly and firmly. Despite the fear the encounter stirred in her, Amina knew there was no time to dwell on it. She needed to get checked at the hospital to make sure everything was fine with her pregnancy. As soon as she arrived at the clinic, the staff quickly ushered her into a private room. A nurse examined her, taking her blood pressure and checking for any signs of stress or injury. Amina did her best to reassure the nurse, but inside, her mind kept returning to the cop. She couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done, not just for herself, but for all the others who might be subjected to the same treatment. The nurse assured her that everything looked fine, but Amina couldn't help but feel unsettled. She left the clinic later that evening, still trying to process the event. As she stepped into her car, her thoughts went to the officer, to the aggression he had shown, and to the way he had assumed she was nothing more than a target for his misplaced anger. Amina's mind made a decision that she wasn't sure was going to be easy, but she knew she had to act. She would not let this go, not only for her own sake, but for the sake of anyone else who might suffer from the officer's unchecked behavior. It was time to hold him accountable. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was still in his squad car, driving away from the scene, completely unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There had been a brief moment when he saw the woman's calm demeanor, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. But he quickly brushed it aside. He was the one in control, and he was used to getting things done his way. However, in the back of his mind, the whispers of his colleagues began to reach him. They spoke of the woman in a way he didn't understand, calling her a respected figure, someone not to be trifled with. But it was too late for him to turn back. The moment he had laid hands on her, everything had changed. What he didn't realize was that his actions were now about to have consequences far beyond what he could ever imagine. The next few days after the incident felt like a blur for Officer Daniels. He tried to move on, putting the encounter with the pregnant woman out of his mind, but it wasn't that easy. The whispers from his colleagues about her began to bother him. They spoke of her with a level of respect he didn't fully understand, as if she were someone important. At first, he thought it was just another rumor, but the more he heard, the more curious he became. One day, while sitting at his desk at the precinct, he overheard a conversation between two officers. They were talking about a judge, Judge Amina Walker, and how she was known to be one of the most respected figures in the entire country's legal system. He had never heard of her, but the tone of their voices made it clear that they held her in high regard. They mentioned how she had recently made some important rulings that had shaken the legal world, and that even the most powerful politicians respected her. But there was something else, something that caught Officer Daniels' attention. She was also feared. Feared. The word echoed in his mind as he sat up straighter in his chair, feeling a chill run down his spine. He realized with a jolt that the woman he had stopped on the street was none other than this powerful judge. His mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The calmness she had shown in the face of his aggression, the way she hadn't reacted with fear or anger, it all made sense now. She wasn't just a random passerby. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he had just crossed the line by laying a hand on her. The realization hit him hard. He knew he had made a mistake, but he didn't know just how big that mistake was. He tried to shake off the dread that began to settle in his stomach. Surely, nothing would come of it, right? He tried to convince himself that maybe she wouldn't report the incident. After all, she hadn't said anything at the time, and he had simply assumed she was someone he could intimidate. But deep down, Officer Daniels couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. It gnawed at him. He started to second-guess everything, from the way he had treated her to how easily he had let his anger take control. He thought about her quiet strength and the way she had carried herself, almost as if she knew exactly who she was. But he didn't know who she was. Not yet. A few days later, his suspicions were confirmed when a colleague handed him a news article. It was a piece about Judge Amina Walker, and the headline alone made his heart skip a beat. Judge Amina Walker, a powerful woman who commands respect in the courtroom and beyond. The article detailed her rise to prominence and how she had become a pillar of the legal system. It mentioned her recent high-profile cases and how her rulings had made waves in the legal world. He stared at the picture of her, realizing it was the same woman he had stopped. His chest tightened as the weight of his actions finally sunk in. He had no idea who she was, but now it was clear that he had just made a huge mistake. He had punched a woman who was not only well-respected, but was one of the most feared figures in the country. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, and for the first time, Officer Daniels truly understood the consequences of what he had done. This part delves into Officer Daniels' realization of who Judge Amina truly is and how his actions have put him in a dangerous position. It builds tension and suspense as the cop begins to understand the gravity of the situation. The days following his realization felt like they were dragging on for Officer Daniels. The quiet unease he had felt when he first discovered Judge Amina Walker's true identity began to grow stronger with each passing hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. As he sat at his desk, staring at the news article about her, his thoughts kept racing. He had never imagined that the woman he had accosted on the street was one of the most powerful figures in the country. How could he have been so careless? At the precinct, whispers about the incident began to spread. Daniels overheard his fellow officers talking about the encounter, some of them with genuine concern. They spoke of how Amina Walker was a woman not to be crossed, a respected judge who had the backing of the highest authorities in the country. The more they talked, the more Daniels realized just how serious things were. Despite the growing tension, Daniels tried to brush it off. He told himself that nothing would happen. Maybe she would let it go. After all, it wasn't like he had physically harmed her, right? He kept telling himself that maybe, just maybe, she would just let the incident fade away. But deep down, he knew it was wishful thinking. The first hint that something was wrong came when Daniels was called into his captain's office. He had no idea what was coming, but the weight of the captain's serious expression told him everything he needed to know. The moment Daniels sat down, the captain wasted no time. "Daniels, we've received a formal complaint," the captain said, his voice firm. "Judge Amina Walker has filed a report regarding the incident with you." Daniel's stomach sank. His mind raced as he tried to process what the captain was saying. A formal complaint. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. "I've been told to conduct an internal investigation into your actions, Daniels," the captain continued. "This isn't something we can ignore. You've got a lot of people worried right now." Daniel's hands gripped the edge of his chair as he tried to remain calm. His thoughts were a whirlwind of regret. He wanted to explain, to tell his captain that he hadn't meant for things to escalate the way they had. But the captain's stern gaze made it clear that no excuses would be accepted. A mistake had been made, and now Daniels had to face the consequences. As the captain spoke, Daniels couldn't help but think back to the day of the incident. He recalled the woman's calm, almost unbothered demeanor in the face of his aggression. At the time, he had thought she was just another person to push around. But now he understood that she wasn't just another person. She was someone who had the power to make or break his career. The investigation began almost immediately. Daniels was asked to provide his version of events, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. After all, the incident had been reported by Judge Walker herself, and her word carried more weight than his ever could. The pressure began to mount, and Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for was at risk. He spent the next few days in a daze, his mind consumed by the growing sense of dread. The more he thought about Judge Walker, the more he realized how foolish he had been. She wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of fairness, strength, and respect. And now, because of his rash actions, he had put everything he had worked for on the line. In the back of his mind, Daniels knew he had to do something to make things right. But what could he do? He couldn't take back his actions. All he could do now was wait, and hope that somehow Judge Walker would find it in her heart to show mercy. This part focuses on the beginning of the investigation and Daniel's mounting realization that the consequences of his actions are far-reaching. It builds tension and engages the audience with the uncertainty Daniels feels as he faces the possible fallout from the incident. The days after the internal investigation started were some of the most difficult in Officer Daniels' career. The pressure was intense, and every time he walked into the precinct, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Whispers filled the hallways, and more than once, he overheard officers discussing the investigation. He had never felt so exposed. But it wasn't just the officers at the precinct who were watching. Word about the incident had spread beyond the police station, reaching the media and the public. Judge Amina Walker was no ordinary judge. She was someone who held immense power and influence in the country. Her every move was followed by journalists, and now they were all asking the same question. What would she do about the officer who had treated her so unjustly? Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued. The tension kept building, and Daniels could feel the walls closing in. He thought about the moment when he had first seen her, how he had assumed she was just another person to push around. The image of her calm, unflinching gaze stayed with him. She hadn't shown fear or anger, just quiet strength. It was a strength that had confused him, but now he saw it for what it was, a strength that came from years of hard work and a position that he could never even dream of holding. Then, one day, Daniels was called into a meeting. His captain looked even more serious than usual, and that was saying something. Sitting at the desk with his hands folded, the captain motioned for Daniels to take a seat. As Daniels sat down, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "You're going to meet her, Daniels," the captain said, his voice low and measured. "Judge Walker wants to speak with you." Daniels' stomach turned. He hadn't been expecting this. He had imagined all kinds of consequences for his actions, but facing Judge Amina Walker in person was something he wasn't ready for. He had read about her, heard the rumors, and even seen her in news reports. But now he would have to face her and hear what she had to say. The captain didn't give him much time to prepare. "She'll be here at 2 p.m. Be ready." As the time drew nearer, Daniels found it difficult to focus. He sat in his office, staring at the clock, every minute feeling like an eternity. What would she say to him? Would she be as calm as she had been the day they met, or would she confront him with the full force of her authority? He didn't know what to expect, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his fate was in her hands. Finally, the moment arrived. Judge Amina Walker walked into the room, and for a moment, Daniels could hardly believe his eyes. She stood tall and confident, her presence commanding the room without a word. She was dressed in simple clothes, but it was clear that she was a woman who was used to being respected. The room seemed to shrink in her presence, and Daniels immediately felt the weight of her gaze upon him. She didn't speak immediately. She stood there for a moment, silently assessing him. Then, in a calm but firm voice, she began. "Officer Daniels," she said, her words cutting through the tension in the room, "I'm here to understand what happened that day. I want to hear from you, and I want to hear the truth." Daniels swallowed hard, his throat dry. The moment he had feared was finally here, and he knew there was no escaping the truth. He couldn't hide from his actions. He had to face her, and perhaps face the consequences of his mistake. This part builds the anticipation for the confrontation between Officer Daniels and Judge Amina Walker. It delves into Daniels' growing anxiety as he prepares to face the woman he had wronged, while also highlighting the gravity of the situation. The tension continues to rise, keeping the audience engaged. The moment Judge Amina Walker spoke, Officer Daniels felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable authority. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. She wasn't here to lecture him or scold him. She was here to get answers, and he knew that the truth, whatever it was, would determine his future. She stood across from him, her posture straight, her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity. Daniels had never felt so small in his life. He had spent years on the force, dealing with difficult situations and difficult people, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The woman he had wrongly confronted on the street was now standing before him, and he realized just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just any judge. She was someone who commanded respect from everyone, regardless of their rank or status. "I want you to tell me what happened that day," Judge Walker said, her voice steady and unwavering. "From your perspective." Daniels hesitated for a moment. He had replayed the events in his mind over and over, but now, facing her, he wasn't sure how to start. He had always been confident when speaking to others, but there was something about this situation that made his words stick in his throat. He took a deep breath and began. I thought you were doing something suspicious," he said, his voice low. "I saw you walking alone, and I thought I had to stop you. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just acted, instinctively." Judge Walker nodded, listening carefully, but her expression remained unreadable. Daniels couldn't tell if she was judging him or simply waiting for him to continue. The silence hung between them, and for a moment, he regretted not taking a different approach. "I didn't realize who you were," Daniels continued, his voice gaining a little more strength. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't trying to hurt you, but I was aggressive. I shouldn't have been." Judge Walker didn't interrupt. She simply waited, giving him the space to speak, her presence both intimidating and calm. She had seen many people try to justify their actions, to explain away their mistakes, but she wasn't interested in excuses. She wanted to hear the truth, not a defense. "You should have known better," she said, her tone soft but firm. "You're a law enforcement officer. Your job is to protect, not to instill fear in people." Daniels felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He knew she was right. He had failed in his duty. He had let his personal biases and impatience cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his words sincere. "I shouldn't have done it. I'm not proud of how I acted, and I know I've hurt you." Judge Walker's gaze softened for a brief moment, and Daniels could see that she was considering his words. But she wasn't just judging his actions. She was judging the system that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked. She knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about a broader issue, about a system that sometimes failed to hold people accountable for their actions. "You've made a mistake, Officer Daniels," she said after a long pause. "But you're not the only one who needs to be held accountable here. This incident isn't just about one officer's poor judgment. It's about a larger pattern of behavior. And it's something that needs to change." Daniels nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He knew that his mistake wasn't isolated, that there were others who shared his prejudices, and that the system itself had room for improvement. But for now, all he could do was take responsibility for his actions and hope that, somehow, he could make things right. Judge Walker stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "I'll be making my recommendation to the department," she said, "but you've taken the first step by owning up to what you've done. That's something." As she turned to leave, Daniels felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He knew that the consequences of his actions were far from over, but at least he had been given the chance to explain himself. And maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of a change, not just for him, but for the system as a whole. This part focuses on the pivotal conversation between Officer Daniels and Judge Walker, highlighting his admission of guilt and her thoughtful, impactful response. The tension between them is palpable, and the story continues to build toward the larger themes of accountability and systemic change. The following days were filled with a sense of uncertainty for Officer Daniels. The meeting with Judge Amina Walker had left a lasting impression on him, and he couldn't stop thinking about the words she had spoken. He knew the conversation wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something bigger. His guilt weighed heavily on him, but there was something else too, a growing sense of responsibility. Judge Walker had given him a chance to admit his wrongs, but she had also made it clear that this wasn't just about his actions. It was about the need for change in a system that had allowed his behavior to go unchallenged. Judge Walker, for her part, had already begun to act. She had submitted her official report to the department, outlining her version of the events and detailing the impact of Daniel's actions. But she hadn't just filed a complaint. She had also made a point to highlight the importance of reform. Her report wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about the broader issue of how officers were trained to handle situations, especially those involving individuals who might not fit into their preconceived notions. As Daniel sat in his car outside the precinct on the morning of the department's meeting, he couldn't help but feel nervous. Today, the decision would be made. He would find out if his career would be over or if there was a chance for redemption. He had made a mistake, but he also understood that mistakes were part of being human. The real question was whether the system, the same system that had let him down, would offer him the chance to make things right. He entered the precinct with a heavy heart. His captain was waiting for him, looking as serious as ever. The captain didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Daniels," he said, "we've reviewed everything, including Judge Walker's report. We know what happened, and we've decided on the next steps." Daniels braced himself. He had no idea what was coming, but he was ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. He knew he had to take responsibility for his actions. "We've decided not to terminate your position," the captain continued, "but this will be on your record. You'll undergo additional training, and there will be probationary periods during which your actions will be closely monitored." Daniels felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't a complete reprieve, but it was an opportunity to learn and to grow from his mistakes. His career wasn't over, but it would be different. The captain looked at him, his expression softening just a little. "This is your chance to prove that you can change. You've got a lot to work on, Daniels. Make it count." The weight of those words hit him hard. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. Daniels nodded, determined to make things right. Meanwhile, Judge Amina Walker had made sure that her report didn't just disappear into the system. She had pushed for better policies in training officers to handle encounters more fairly and with respect. Her influence had already begun to spark a conversation about police reform, one that went beyond individual actions and looked at how entire systems needed to evolve. She didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted justice for everyone who might face the same kind of mistreatment in the future. Daniels knew that this was far from over. The road ahead would be difficult, and he would have to prove that he could learn from his past mistakes. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. He had a responsibility not just as an officer, but as a person, to do better. And perhaps, just perhaps, his encounter with Judge Amina Walker would be the catalyst for the change he needed, not just in his own life, but in the world around him. As the days passed, Daniels focused on his training, making a genuine effort to understand the deeper issues that had led to his actions. He knew he would never forget the look in Judge Walker's eyes when she spoke to him. It was a look that held him accountable, but it also offered him a chance to grow. And that was something he couldn't take lightly. This part brings closure to Officer Daniels' journey, showing his opportunity for redemption and the beginning of meaningful change. It highlights the power of responsibility, growth, and the ongoing efforts for reform, while also emphasizing the positive influence of Judge Walker. The story wraps up with a hopeful tone, leaving the audience with a sense of resolution.